talk on biphasic sleeping. I hear it was great. I hear many people did not sleep too much. So my goal here for today is just to talk about some of the common tools that I use as a software developer. Those of you who have already been working as a software developer are probably using this stuff, but this is more aimed at students and kind of seeing like what are the normal tools you're going to be using as you move forward in your career. So I don't really have any strong opinions other than that some of them you're just going to end up having to use. So the first one I'd like to talk about is Gist. Basically, it's just an extension of GitHub. GitHub, well, I guess we could dive into that real quick. So GitHub's just a code repository. It's public. They offer free repositories for any open source applications. And then if you're working on your own personal projects that are private, you can store your code here, and they've got some pretty basic pricing. This again is sort of one of those things that it's just a network effect, right? Like most people use GitHub, therefore you're going to end up having to interface with it at some point. And so it's pretty simple. I'm not going to go into it too much other than that, you know, hopefully you've used Git and you have committed some code. But built on top or in tandem with Git is gists, which are pretty sweet. They allow you to create quick snippets of code you can share with people. So instead of just like sending somebody a text or like sending an email with code in it, you can just go to gist.github.com, and when you're signed in as your own user, you can create these little snippets of code, and you can create private ones and public ones. You can update them over time, and then if somebody wants to download it, you can just click the raw button and you can get access to that. And then if there's multiple files, you can just click the download zip button. So that's pretty sweet. I use it all the time. The other nice thing is that they have syntax highlighting if you tell what you're actually writing your code in. So you know, if you're sharing Ruby or something, somebody doesn't have to go and like set up an IDE or their code editor so that they can actually read the code. So I'm a huge fan of that. All right, so moving on, the next thing is Slack. So obviously this weekend, we've been kind of harping on it a lot. Basically, for those of you who are a little bit older, you're probably familiar with like AOL Instant Messenger. And for those of you who are even older, you're probably familiar with IRC networks. I still hang out in a couple of those channels. But this is kind of where things have headed, is we've gotten rid of this idea of synchronous communication, and now we're sort of this hybrid, right? Like sometimes we use email, sometimes we use like text message or chat, but corporate and just like meetup groups and stuff are all kind of switching to Slack. Part of the reason is very similar to GitHub, right? They allow you to have a free Slack channel for groups that are open, and it's good enough, right? I mean, the purpose of this is sort of a hybrid of, you know, we have some chat rooms where we're accomplishing and able to have conversations with a lot of people, but then also you can send direct messages to people and everybody can sort of use it how they feel. Again, I'm not going to get too deep into this. Some people like to do threads where like they'll post and then people will reply directly to that post. Assistive Technology of Alaska does that. It freaked me out the first time I saw it because it looked like there was like 5 conversations happening, but it was really nice because for them, they have channels that don't get a lot of traffic. So in their technology channel, when somebody has an issue, they post about that issue and then people will reply directly to the thread. And then if you haven't been there for a while, you can go back on and see what's been said. So like an example of this is if I go into say events and I've got this post that I made. I'm actually logged in as Link Larson on this machine, but I can start a thread and I can say, awesome, let's go. And now that is sort of like tucked in here. So imagine if you've got 50 technology issues and every time you're just replying directly in the channel, depending on how an organization decides to kind of set their chat up and what standards they have, that can be really beneficial. So there you go. That's the 2 cents on Slack. We tend to use it pretty haphazardly as the Dev Alliance. There's a lot of chat that sort of goes back and forth, and it's kind of just all over the place. One other thing to note is that if you have admin permissions, you can use these special channel tags for like @here or @channel. And those allow us to actually like send a notification out to anybody in that channel. So @channel will say anybody who's in the channel, @here will say anybody who's live in the channel right now. So yeah, Misty, she's live. Okay. So yeah, that's your basic runaround on Slack. And again, I'm not advocating that it's like the best one. I'm just saying like this is probably what you're gonna encounter. So yeah, don't fight it. There's Discord. There's I think Mattermost is like another one. There's a handful of them. They're all
Microsoft Teams.
Yeah, Microsoft Teams. They're all basically the same, right? They have 80% of the same functionality with a handful of nuances that are different. Where I have found this to be pretty cool though is that no, that's not it. So if you're into a specific programming language, almost all programming groups now have created their own Slack. So like if you're into Golang, there's a Golang Slack. If you're into Ruby, there's a Ruby on Rails link Slack, I think. And I'm part of that, right? And so you can go in there and you can talk with other people. There's like channels for what's going on, and you know they keep track of some of these stats so you can see. So I found this to actually be the most useful way to keep in touch with a community and get help on things, as opposed to going to GitHub and leaving a pull request. Like there might just be somebody in one of these language specific channels that's familiar with the library who's there in real time, or we'll get back to you. So Slack's pretty cool. I would tend to think of it a little bit as a little bit more of an a little bit more than a chat application, right? Like take advantage of those groups that exist. All right, moving on. So another thing that I like, if we're talking about code repositories, is Git-K. And this is really good for helping you track down like merge pull requests and like what's going on in your code repository. I apologize, I keep trying to plug in my machine and it doesn't work on here, so I can't do an interactive example on this this Windows machine. But essentially you can see what the commit message was, you can see who made the commit, what the time was, what files changed, and then you can sort of browse through and check that stuff out. And that's really handy, especially when you're trying to deal with merge conflicts, or if you've got a scenario where somebody merged a piece of code that broke something, like you can see it visually, or you can see, maybe where you've got like a really specific bug, not necessarily that it even broke something, but that like, every 5th run, there's some anomaly that you can't track down. You can go back and you can actually see what each of those branches are and see how the code changed, and just having a visual guide can be really nice when you're trying to track this stuff down, as opposed to using the command line tools. There are a handful other ones. Bradley, I know you use one that's a little bit different. What was that called?
GitKraken. They are free for open source, but they're SaaS for paid work.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, there's a few of these. The one thing I like about Git-K, it's free, it's cross-platform. I use it on Linux, Mac, whatever. So that's another good one to help you track down some of this stuff. One thing I will say though is I do not like using a visual editor for actually making code commits. I think that's like the worst thing you could possibly do. I don't know why, but it never seems to go well. I always run into issues, and I don't know if that's because of the GUI that's built on top of Git or why that really happens, but like Visual Studio has stuff built in, and maybe I've just never taken the time to learn it, but for me, I've always found it's just easier to commit your code via the command line, and then viewing changes or whatever is fine to do using a GUI, but stay away from that for actually making changes to the repository. All right, so the next one I want to talk about is probably the holy war of holy wars for developers, which is what editor you're gonna use. Now, I personally don't care. Some people really do and are really passionate about your editor. What I'm here to say is like find an editor you like and get really good at it. that pays dividends across the life cycle of your career. I'm a Vim user. There's a handful of people I know who use it in this community. Some people are really passionate about Emacs as well. The main thing is that all of these editors allow you to do a lot of customizing so that you can get really proficient with your hotkeys and commands. And in my opinion, kind of the pinnacle is when you can use an editor and you can jump around and edit code and run commands and do stuff you need to without having to remove your hands from the keyboard. That's really nice to not have to like use a mouse to copy and paste stuff. Again, you know, I don't know that that's necessarily going to make you a 10x coder, but what I found is that if I'm doing a bunch of stuff in a text file, it's sort of like less cruft that's in my brain as I'm doing stuff, where I can just sort of edit and keep moving forward and not have to think about moving code around or highlighting and copying and pasting text. So a lot of these editors can be kind of challenging to use and set up. I would say Vim is one of the most difficult. But one of the reasons it's really popular is because it's installed on most systems by default, whether that's Linux or Unix, so Mac. I don't think it's bundled with Windows, but I don't know. Windows is making some big steps forward in their terminal, and actually they just released this really funny video not that long ago. Advertising their new terminal for Windows, which I think is really funny. Let's see. Yeah, it looks like a Mac commercial. I apologize, there's no sound. It also sounds like a Mac commercial, which I think is super funny. But alas, we're not going to get any sound. Anyways, yeah, basically this is their new sexy terminal. Something to check out as well. You know, for a long time, there was sort of the standard terminal in Windows, which was really difficult to use. Then they came out with PowerShell, and there's a handful of others. I'm going to close this. Basically, you just need to know it looks sexy, right? So for Mac, I really like iTerm 2. It's pretty easy. It's slightly better than the one that comes bundled in OS X, but it's got a handful of nice things in terms of like hotkeys and shortcuts and like default behavior when you end a program. But again, most of these tools are going to do the same 80% of functionality, and then it's just, you know, you get 20% different from each one. I will tell you though, no tool is perfect, so you're going to have to get to know and love the quirks. Visual Studio Code is actually, I believe at this point in time, it's the most popular editor. And what I'll actually say is that Visual Studio Code is headed more in the direction of being a development environment, or an IDE, an interactive development environment, instead of just a code editor. So what that means is that there's a lot of plugins, there's a lot of extensions, and it sort of has terminal emulation built in. And the idea is that you can kind of do everything you need to do for the life cycle of developing your program directly in Visual Studio Code. And this is based off of Atom, which was another IDE that was, I believe it might have been browser-based, and now they've got desktop versions of it. Electron, yeah. So, yeah, small detail, but essentially it allows you to write web applications that run on your desktop. So Visual Studio Code is awesome. I've used it a bit. What I really like about it is that I can set up all of the Vim hotkeys that I'm used to, which if you're a Vim user, Vim is all hotkeys. So that's really nice, is that like I can still have that, you know, leave my hands on the keyboard feeling to it, but then also you get a bunch of stuff for free that can be
The Bluetooth device is connected.
You can get a bunch of stuff for free that can be a total pain to set up in Vim, like your plugins. So if you are using, say you're editing a Go project for your first time, when you open that in Visual Studio, it will say, this looks like a Go file. We recommend this plugin. And you hit install and it refreshes, and all of a sudden you've got all of your autocomplete and IntelliSense and everything ready to go. So I'm a huge fan of Visual Studio Code. I think it's great. We also, the Dev Alliance, is also sponsored by JetBrains. So for those of you who are ready to commit full-time to an IDE, they have some pretty cool editors. Their big one that they sort of broke out with was Intellij, which is a Java IDE. And again, it sort of does all of the stuff you would expect, but they have really, really good autocomplete, really good like code folding and good breakpoints, and like your debugger is all built into this. And the nice thing here is that it's very little configuration, and it makes code pretty transportable. If everybody is using the same IDE. So a lot of times when you're in an organization, you'll see that like, you know, all the DevOps people have decided on an IDE, they've built plugins and customized their tooling for the way that organization runs, and then, you know, they distribute that to all of the programmers. So that's my 2 cents on editors. You know, the slight difference between an IDE and a text editor is a text editor tends to be pretty bare bones. It'll have, you know, some basic syntax highlighting depending on the language you're using and some hotkeys. An IDE generally tends to deal with plugins and debugging and like a bunch of other stuff. And the other small factor is that, you know, when you're using a text editor, it does a lot less, so it tends to be a little bit snappier and faster to kind of write code and do stuff in. And then an editor, the more plugins and stuff that you add to it, the slower and a little bit laggier that it gets as you go. So there you go, code editors. The last thing, and potentially the most controversial, is Twitter. I don't know if any of you all use social media, but I, at this point, have pretty much tried to stay away from Facebook. I think a lot of people in here might agree that they're pretty evil and we're giving them all of our information for free and they're making a bunch of money off of it. But Twitter is where conversations are happening about tech. And whether we like it or not, like this is probably the best way to get plugged into a given community. So if you're into Go, if you're into Ruby, like all of the top people are on Twitter, and you can follow like what they're saying, and when people go to conferences, they post about those conferences. So like David Hannemeyer Hansen from who created Ruby on Rails, like he posts on here all the time. And you can sort of see his stuff, you can see what he's thinking, what he's talking about. He tends to be a little bit more politically oriented, but like Bill Kennedy from Arden Labs, he's on here and he's constantly talking about stuff. So he just promoted his latest blog post on how to use Go modules, and this is just, it's great content. So if you're really trying to better yourself in your career, this is probably the single best place to get plugged into a community. And from here, you can actually make a lot of personal connections. It still kind of blows my mind how this works, but it's different for us because we're in Alaska and we're so removed. When you're down in the States or in the hotbeds of technology and you start kind of going back and forth and you're talking about technical stuff, there's a good possibility you're going to meet these people at a conference and then you're going to hang out and you're going to become friends. And so us being in Alaska, for whatever reason, we just don't use Twitter. That's something that I'm trying to kind of advocate for, is that we start to use Twitter and we start to get a little bit more plugged in. And this is why, is that you start to meet people who are pioneers in what they're doing, and from there you can go to conferences, you can have real conversations, you can become friends. And a lot of times that's how you get your next job. It's not about putting together resumes and cold sending out, you know, hey, hire me, I'm applying for this job. It's like, hey, this is my expertise. This is what I'm looking for. I'm gonna let people in my network know that I'm looking for a job. And there are always companies who are looking to hire, and this is a good way to get plugged into those companies. So those are my kind of tools for the trade once you're becoming a professional programmer and building up your career. Does anybody have any questions, any comments?
I guess one that doesn't often make the list might be Stack Overflow.
Yeah, sure.
not as a way to solve the errors you're getting in the console, but as a way to, as a social network itself. I mean, when you're active on there and you're upvoting, hiring managers sometimes notice that and notice how helpful you're being and how well you document your solutions to things. So if you're looking to shine in a way that LinkedIn can't really give you, increasing your activity on Stack Overflow, which you're probably on every day anyway if you're trying to make stuff work.
Yeah, so another quick note I want to jump into, and this is definitely a tangent, is this idea of imposter syndrome. And the reason that this flows into here is that yesterday I was working on a stored procedure in MySQL for one of the projects that was floating around here, and I just jumped in to work on this for a couple hours because I've been in and out. I haven't taken on a full project for the weekend, so I've been bouncing around. And I haven't written a stored procedure since like 2012. There's another developer in the room who's helping me, and we were going back and forth and spitballing ideas and some good, positive, constructive conflict. He's a Google wizard on his phone. I'm still like baffled at how fast he was able to get answers to stuff. But what was really funny is our project sponsor was here from Beat It Stream, and what he saw was us like scrambling to fix these really silly syntax things. And we absolutely knew what we were trying to accomplish. We just couldn't figure out how to get it into the right MySQL syntax. And so we basically spent like an hour and a half just like Googling stored procedures and like going to Stack Overflow and looking at all of these things. And what was funny here was that he's like waiting to get out of the door. And we're just like, 2 more minutes. Like, we almost got it. We're so close. We're so ready. And finally, we ended up getting it. And it was like 30 seconds after he left. And I took a screenshot and sent him the query showing that we had gotten it together. And the joke was sort of like he had never seen the development process live. But for us, like, this is normal. We spend a huge portion of our career on Stack Overflow, Googling for problems, and just trying to figure out some specific nuance because we know what we're trying to do, but we may not know the implementation in the language or the database that we're trying to do it in. So Stack Overflow is another really common place to find yourself. And as Bradley said, when you've got a whole bunch of karma, that is something that employers will look at. And I actually have a buddy who got hired locally because he had like 5,000 karma on his Stack Overflow profile, and somebody headhunted him because he had added, he had Scala experience, and he had, so much karma on Stack Overflow. There are some really fascinating people you can find on here. There was a guy a while back who I don't know if I'll be able to find it. I'll see if I can track it down later. But this guy had like this crazy specific knowledge of the Java time package because he was looking at this weird oddity where he was adding some times and it didn't make sense. And this guy chimes in, and this dude must have had like 100,000 karma on Stack Overflow, but he knew that there was an adjustment in time. Right? So like this was library agnostic. It was just that he had been the one to implement it in this Java time library, but he knew about an adjustment of time in like 800 BC or something. And so that had shifted time all the way to our current year. And he knew that because of that shift in time, this is why the changes were going to be different, and that it actually was in fact not a bug, but just a result of a change in the measurement of time in our history. So you can find lots of crazy, weird things through Stack Overflow that way. I'll see if I can find it and post it in Slack at some point. Did you have a question?
I was just going to mention, if you are using Stack, which is great, the first entry is usually the problem. Don't find your solution in the first entry.
Yeah. that's a very good point. And there is also
keep reading.
Keep reading for sure. And there is also another piece of etiquette I would like to just put out there for all programmers everywhere. If you post a problem and then find your own solution, please go and answer your own question and upvote it and tell me, and I will go upvote it. If you need the karma, ping me, I will give it to you. But there is nothing more frustrating when you find a question on Stack Overflow where somebody asks the question and then responds, "Oh, I fixed it," and they just close the question. And you're like, Okay, but how? Did you work around it? Is this not possible? Is there a real solution? So do us all a favor, be a better code citizen. Answer your own questions with the technical information. Cool. All right. Any questions from Juno? I don't even know if Juno made it on. Hopefully somebody was listening. Anybody else here? I think Fairbanks is still muted. All right, cool. Thanks, guys. I don't know how to mute us, so hopefully Arsh will do that at some point. But yeah, that's Tools of the Trade. If you got any questions, hit me on Slack.
Ooh.